It was a quiet August morning in Birchwood, Maine, when the town awoke to news that would shock everyone to their core. 18-year-old Benjamin Morris, a shy and introverted young man, had been found dead in the sprawling mansion of his 67-year-old wife, Eleanor Donovan. What initially seemed like a tragic accident soon unraveled into a twisted tale of manipulation, control, and murder. Benjamin had always been a bit of a loner, living with his single mother on the outskirts of town. His father had left when he was just 6 years old, leaving his mother to work long hours at the local diner to support them. As a result, Benjamin grew up largely unsupervised, spending most of his time alone. He wasn't a bad kid, just quiet, and that made him easy to overlook in a town where everyone knew each other's business. By the time he turned 18, Benjamin had dropped out of high school and taken up a job as a delivery boy for the local courier service. It wasn't much, but it paid the bills, and he figured it was better than nothing. It was during one of these delivery runs that his life would change forever. On a hot September afternoon, Benjamin was sent to deliver a package to the Donovan estate, a massive, imposing mansion that sat on the outskirts of Birchwood. The house had always been a point of curiosity for the locals. It was old, secluded, and rumored to be haunted. Eleanor Donovan, the owner, was a wealthy widow who had inherited the estate after the death of her husband nearly 15 years prior. She was known to be reclusive, rarely seen in town except for the occasional charity event or shopping trip. When Benjamin arrived at the Donovan estate that day, he expected to be greeted by a maid or a butler, but to his surprise, Eleanor herself answered the door. She was a striking figure, tall and elegant, with silver hair neatly pinned up and eyes that seemed to pierce right through him. Despite her age, she carried herself with a youthful energy that belied her years. "Come in," she said, her voice smooth and commanding. It wasn't a request. Benjamin hesitated but stepped inside, feeling the weight of the enormous house pressing down on him as he crossed the threshold. The interior of the mansion was just as grand as he had imagined. High ceilings, ornate furniture, and walls lined with expensive art. It was a world far removed from his own modest upbringing. Eleanor invited him to sit and offered him tea, something that felt more like an order than a gesture of hospitality. Benjamin, unsure of what else to do, accepted. They sat in the grand parlor, sipping tea and making small talk, though it quickly became clear that Eleanor was more interested in him than the weather or the delivery he had brought. "So, tell me about yourself, Benjamin," she said, her gaze never leaving him. There was something unsettling about the way she looked at him, as though she was studying him, assessing him. But Benjamin, who had never been the center of attention, found himself drawn to her in a way he couldn't quite explain. He told her about his life, his mother, his job, his lack of direction. She listened intently, nodding at all the right moments, her interest seemingly genuine. From that day on, Benjamin found himself returning to the Donovan estate more and more often. Sometimes it was for a delivery, but more often it was because Eleanor had invited him. She found excuses to have him around, help with small tasks, fixing things around the house, or simply keeping her company. Each time, she would shower him with compliments and gifts, new clothes, expensive meals, even a new phone. For a boy who had grown up with so little, it was intoxicating. The people of Birchwood began to notice Benjamin's frequent visits to the Donovan estate, and rumors quickly spread. Some said he was working as her personal assistant, others whispered that there was something more going on between them. But no one could have predicted what was really happening behind the mansion's closed doors. By late November, Eleanor's affection for Benjamin had grown into something far more intense. She began to talk about their future together, hinting at the possibility of a relationship that went beyond friendship. Benjamin, though flattered by the attention and the gifts, wasn't sure how to respond. She was nearly 50 years older than him, but the allure of her wealth and power was difficult to resist. Then, one evening, as they sat together in the parlor, Eleanor made her intentions clear. She proposed to him. The question took Benjamin by surprise. He hadn't seen it coming. But Eleanor was persuasive, painting a picture of a life filled with luxury and comfort, a future where he would never have to worry about money again. To a boy who had spent his entire life scraping by, it was an offer too tempting to refuse. In early December, they were married in a small, private ceremony at the Donovan estate. Only a few of Eleanor's closest acquaintances were in attendance, older men and women from her social circle. Benjamin's side of the ceremony was empty. He had no family or friends there to witness the union. It was as though he had been completely absorbed into Eleanor's world, leaving his old life behind. In the weeks that followed the wedding, Benjamin began to see a different side of Eleanor. The gifts continued, but now they came with strings attached. She became more controlling, dictating how he should dress, where he could go, and who he could speak to. His once carefree life now felt suffocating as Eleanor's grip on him tightened. Benjamin quickly realized that he was not a partner in this marriage. He was a possession, something to be controlled and displayed at her whim. But by then, it was too late to turn back. He was trapped in a life that was nothing like the dream he had imagined. And as the days turned into weeks, Benjamin's isolation grew. Eleanor discouraged him from seeing his few remaining friends, cutting him off from the outside world. The mansion, once a symbol of wealth and grandeur, now felt like a prison. He was surrounded by luxury, but it came at a cost he hadn't anticipated. As Christmas approached, Benjamin's thoughts turned darker. He confided in his old friend Emily Harrington, one of the few people he still trusted, about his fears. Emily urged him to leave Eleanor, to get out before it was too late. But Benjamin, now financially dependent on his wife and fearful of what she might do if he tried to leave, felt like there was no escape. The life he thought he had wanted had turned into a nightmare, and the more he tried to find a way out, the tighter Eleanor's grip became. By the time January rolled around, Benjamin Morris was beginning to understand the full extent of the trap he had walked into. What started as an opportunity for a better life had quickly morphed into something sinister. Eleanor Donovan, his new wife, was no longer the gracious benefactor who had showered him with gifts and promises of comfort. Instead, she had become increasingly possessive, manipulative, and obsessive. Benjamin felt more like a captive than a husband. Eleanor, now 67, had always been a woman of immense wealth and influence. Her late husband had left her with more money than she could ever spend in a lifetime, but also with an unfulfilled desire for control, over people, over circumstances, and now, over Benjamin. What she saw in him was not just youth and vitality, but a blank canvas on which she could project her will. She treated Benjamin not as an equal, but as a project, a possession to be molded and shaped to her liking. In the early days of their marriage, Benjamin had tried to adapt. After all, the gifts kept coming: fine clothes, expensive watches, dinners at exclusive restaurants. Eleanor lavished him with luxury, but the more she gave, the more she demanded in return. She began to dictate everything about his life: how he dressed, who he could see, where he could go. She monitored his phone calls, limited his social interactions, and made it clear that he was to devote himself entirely to her. The pressure was suffocating. At first, Benjamin had tried to push back. He would make excuses to leave the house, claiming he needed to see his mother or run errands. But Eleanor always found a way to reel him back in, using guilt and manipulation to keep him by her side. "After everything I've done for you," she would say, her voice dripping with disappointment, "you owe me your loyalty, Benjamin. I saved you from that pathetic life. Don't forget that." It wasn't long before Benjamin found himself completely isolated from the outside world. His friends had stopped calling. His mother, already distant, had given up trying to reach him. Eleanor had succeeded in cutting him off from anyone who might encourage him to leave. She had wrapped him in a cocoon of wealth and privilege, but it was a cocoon that also served as a cage. In the small town of Birchwood, rumors about Benjamin's new life spread like wildfire. People whispered about the young man who had married the reclusive widow, and speculation grew about what was really going on behind the closed doors of the Donovan estate. Some believed Benjamin had married for money, while others thought Eleanor had some hold over him, a secret that kept him tied to her. But no one could have imagined the depth of the control Eleanor exerted over her husband. One evening in early January, Benjamin decided to visit his old friend Emily Harrington. She was one of the few people he still trusted, though they hadn't spoken much since the wedding. He needed someone to talk to, someone who wasn't Eleanor, and Emily was the only person who might understand. He made his way to the small coffee shop where they had agreed to meet, but the entire time, he felt a knot of anxiety growing in his stomach. What if Eleanor found out? What would she do? These thoughts plagued him, but he pushed them aside, knowing he needed to see Emily. When he arrived, Emily was already seated at a corner table, a worried expression on her face. She had heard the rumors, and she knew something wasn't right. As Benjamin sat down, she gave him a long, searching look. "Ben, what's going on?" she asked softly. "You don't look like yourself." Benjamin sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's complicated. Eleanor, she's not who I thought she was." Emily leaned forward, her eyes filled with concern. "I've heard the rumors. People say she's controlling, that she's keeping you isolated. Is that true?" Benjamin hesitated, glancing around the coffee shop to make sure no one was listening. "It's worse than that, Em. She's suffocating me. I can't do anything without her knowing. She's always watching me, always telling me what to do. I thought I could handle it, but I don't know how much longer I can keep this up." Emily frowned, her expression darkening. "Ben, you need to get out of there. This isn't normal. It's not healthy. You're not her property. You're her husband." "I know," Benjamin replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it's not that simple. She's got everything. The house, the money. She controls everything. If I leave, where would I go? What would I do? I don't have anything anymore. I gave it all up to be with her. Emily reached across the table, placing her hand on his. "You still have people who care about you. You still have me. Don't let her make you believe you're trapped. There's always a way out." But Benjamin wasn't so sure. Eleanor had made it clear that leaving wasn't an option. She had threatened him, albeit subtly, with losing everything if he ever tried to walk away. And as much as Benjamin wanted to escape, the fear of what she might do kept him frozen in place. That night, when he returned to the Donovan estate, Eleanor was waiting for him in the grand foyer. She stood at the top of the sweeping staircase, her arms crossed, her expression cold. "Where were you?" she demanded, her voice sharp. Benjamin swallowed hard, his heart racing. "I went to see Emily, just for coffee. I needed to talk to someone." Eleanor's eyes narrowed, and she descended the stairs slowly, her heels clicking against the marble floor. "Emily? That girl from your past? I thought I made it clear that your past is behind you, Benjamin. You don't need her. You don't need anyone but me." "I just needed some air," Benjamin said, his voice shaky. "I needed to clear my head." Eleanor stopped in front of him, her eyes flashing with anger. "You don't need to clear your head. You're confused. And I don't appreciate you running off to other people behind my back. You belong here with me. I'm the one who takes care of you. Don't forget that." Benjamin nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I'm sorry. It won't happen again." Eleanor's expression softened, and she reached out to cup his face in her hands. "Good. Because I don't want to lose you, Benjamin. I've given you everything. I've saved you from that miserable life you had before. You owe me your loyalty." Benjamin forced a smile, though inside he felt like he was slowly being suffocated. "I know. I'm grateful." But deep down, he knew that gratitude was the last thing he felt. He was trapped, and the more Eleanor tightened her grip, the more he realized that escape might not be possible. As the weeks went by, Eleanor's behavior became more erratic. She began accusing Benjamin of planning to leave her, of conspiring with his old friends. She monitored his every move, growing more paranoid with each passing day. Benjamin felt like he was walking on eggshells, never knowing when Eleanor's mood would shift from affectionate to furious. By the end of January, Benjamin was a shell of the person he had once been. The life he had imagined with Eleanor, the luxury, the comfort, the freedom, had turned into a nightmare of control and isolation. And as much as he wanted to break free, the fear of what Eleanor might do kept him locked in place. The mansion, once a symbol of wealth and opulence, now felt like a prison, and Benjamin was beginning to realize that there was no escape. February was a particularly cold and bleak month in Birchwood, Maine. The gray skies seemed to press down on the town, mirroring the oppressive atmosphere that had settled over Benjamin Morris's life. By this time, His marriage to Eleanor Donovan had transformed from a source of luxury and excitement into a nightmare of control and fear. The beautiful mansion that had once represented wealth and opportunity now felt more like a gilded cage, trapping him with no way out. Eleanor had grown more volatile with each passing day. Her mood swings were unpredictable, oscillating between sweet affection and violent rage. Benjamin could no longer anticipate what might set her off, and he lived in constant fear of her unpredictable outbursts. She had taken complete control over his life, his finances, his movements, his communication with the outside world. She was always watching, always monitoring, as if she could not bear the thought of him slipping out of her grasp. It wasn't just Eleanor's controlling nature that terrified Benjamin. It was the way she had begun to accuse him of things he hadn't done, of plotting to leave her, of sneaking around behind her back. These accusations were unfounded, but Eleanor seemed to believe them with an intensity that bordered on delusion. She would confront him in the middle of the night, her voice trembling with rage as she demanded to know where he had been, what he had been thinking. Benjamin tried to reassure her, to calm her down, but nothing he said seemed to help. She was spiraling deeper into paranoia, and he was caught in the middle of it. One evening in early February, the tension between them reached a boiling point. It had been a quiet day, or at least that's how it had seemed. Eleanor had spent most of the afternoon in her study, going over some paperwork, while Benjamin had stayed in the living room, reading. He had hoped that the silence between them meant she was in a good mood, but he was wrong. As soon as night fell, Eleanor's demeanor shifted. She stormed into the living room, her face twisted with anger, and stood in front of Benjamin, blocking his view of the book he was holding. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" she hissed, her eyes flashing with fury. Benjamin looked up, startled. "What are you talking about?" Eleanor crossed her arms over her chest, glaring down at him. "Don't play dumb with me, Benjamin. I know what you've been doing. I know you've been planning to leave me. You think I don't see the way you look at me, like I'm some burden? You think I don't know about your little meetings with that girl? What's her name? Emily?" Benjamin's heart sank. He hadn't spoken to Emily since their brief coffee meeting weeks ago, but clearly Eleanor had been stewing over it ever since. "Eleanor, I haven't been meeting with Emily. I saw her once and it was just to talk. That's all." "That's all?" Eleanor repeated, her voice dripping with venom. "You expect me to believe that? You've been sneaking around behind my back, planning to leave me. I can see it in your eyes, Benjamin. You're ungrateful. After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me?" Benjamin stood up, trying to keep his voice calm, though his pulse was racing. "I'm not planning to leave you. I'm not sneaking around. I just needed to talk to someone. That's all. Please. You're misunderstanding." But Eleanor wasn't listening. She had worked herself up into such a state that no amount of reasoning could pull her back from the edge. "You're lying!" she screamed, her voice echoing through the cavernous room. "You've always been lying. I took you in, gave you everything, and now you want to throw it all away." Benjamin tried to step back, to put some distance between them, but Eleanor followed him, her fists clenched at her sides. Her face was flushed with anger, and her eyes were wild. "You're just like the rest of them," she spat. "Ungrateful, selfish, always looking for a way out. But you're not going anywhere, Benjamin. Do you hear me? You're mine. I own you." The words sent a chill down Benjamin's spine. He had always known that Eleanor was possessive, but this was something else. There was a darkness in her eyes that he hadn't seen before, a desperation that frightened him. "I'm not leaving," Benjamin said softly, hoping to calm her down. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." But his words seemed to have the opposite effect. Eleanor's face twisted in rage, and she shoved him hard, sending him stumbling backward into the coffee table. He caught himself before he fell, but the shock of her sudden violence left him reeling. "You're a liar!" she screamed again. "You've been planning this all along. You think I don't know? You think I don't see it? You've been waiting for the right moment to leave me, but you're not getting away with it. I won't let you." Benjamin raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. "Eleanor, please, calm down. I'm not leaving. I promise." But Eleanor wasn't calming down. She was getting worse. She grabbed a vase from the mantelpiece and hurled it across the room, smashing it against the wall. The sound of shattering glass filled the room, and Benjamin flinched. Eleanor's chest was heaving, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked at him with pure hatred in her eyes. "You're nothing without me," she said, her voice trembling. "Nothing. I made you. I gave you everything, and you're not going to throw it all away." Benjamin took a step toward her, trying to reach out, but she recoiled as if his touch would burn her. "Don't!" she snarled. "Don't you dare come near me!" He stopped, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what to do. This was no longer the Eleanor he had married. This was someone else entirely, someone consumed by rage and paranoia. "I just want to talk," Benjamin said, his voice barely above a whisper. But Eleanor wasn't interested in talking. She was too far gone. She turned on her heel and stormed out of the room, leaving Benjamin standing there in the wreckage of their living room, his mind racing. He knew, in that moment, that things had gone too far. There was no going back now. Eleanor had crossed a line, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could endure it. That night, as he lay in bed, unable to sleep, Benjamin's thoughts turned to escape. He had to get out. There was no other option. He couldn't live like this anymore, under Eleanor's constant control, walking on eggshells, waiting for the next explosion of anger. But leaving wouldn't be easy. Eleanor had control over everything, his money, his life, his freedom. He would have to be smart, careful, if he wanted to make it out alive. The idea of running away terrified him, but staying terrified him even more. He couldn't let this continue. Something had to change. But what Benjamin didn't know was that Eleanor had already begun to suspect his plans. And she wasn't about to let him go without a fight. The cold winter of February wrapped the Donovan estate in a blanket of icy silence, but inside, tension was bubbling to the surface. Benjamin Morris had spent the past few weeks trapped in an increasingly volatile situation, and he knew deep down that the cracks were about to widen into a chasm he couldn't escape. The moments of calm between him and Eleanor were becoming shorter, and her outbursts were more frequent, more vicious. By early February, Benjamin was a shell of the hopeful young man he had been just months earlier. His face was pale, his eyes hollow from lack of sleep, and his nerves were frayed beyond repair. The mansion, once a symbol of luxury and comfort, had become a fortress of fear. He felt it in every room, in the way Eleanor's eyes tracked his every movement, in the way she watched him even when she pretended not to. Her paranoia had spiraled out of control, and Benjamin was living in constant dread of what might happen next. The final blow came one cold, bitter night in early February. Eleanor had been growing more suspicious by the day, accusing Benjamin of plotting to leave her, of secretly communicating with his old friends, of sneaking behind her back to plan his escape. In reality, Benjamin hadn't spoken to anyone in weeks. He was too afraid of what Eleanor might do if she caught him trying to reach out for help. The isolation was complete. That night, the air inside the mansion was thick with tension. The usual grandiosity of the Donovan estate felt oppressive, the high ceilings and elaborate chandeliers casting long shadows over the darkened rooms. Benjamin sat in the study, his hands trembling as he stared at the fire flickering in the hearth. He had been sitting there for hours, trying to work up the courage to confront Eleanor, to tell her that he couldn't go on like this. But every time he thought about leaving, fear gripped him, paralyzing him. As he sat there, lost in his thoughts, he didn't hear Eleanor enter the room. When he finally looked up, she was standing in the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest, her eyes locked onto him with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. "You've been awfully quiet tonight," she said, her voice cold and clipped. Benjamin swallowed, trying to keep his voice steady. "Just thinking." "Thinking about what?" she asked, taking a step closer. "About us, about this situation," Benjamin replied cautiously. He didn't want to provoke her, but he couldn't keep avoiding the issue forever. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "What situation?" Benjamin took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. "Eleanor, this isn't working. You know it, and I know it. I can't live like this anymore. I feel like a prisoner in this house." "A prisoner?" Eleanor's voice was sharp with disbelief. "You have everything you could ever want, Benjamin. A beautiful home, wealth, security. And you call that being a prisoner?" "It's not just about the money," Benjamin said, his voice trembling. "You control everything I do. You won't let me see my friends. You won't let me leave the house without your permission. I'm suffocating." Eleanor's expression darkened, and she took another step toward him. "Suffocating? You ungrateful little boy? I gave you everything. I took you out of that pathetic life you had before, and this is how you repay me? By telling me you're suffocating?" "I never asked for any of this," Benjamin shot back, his frustration finally boiling over. "You gave me things I didn't need, things I didn't want. All I wanted was a chance to live my life, but you've taken that from me." Eleanor's face twisted with anger, and for a moment Benjamin saw something truly frightening in her eyes. "You think you can just walk away from me? After everything I've done for you? No, Benjamin. You belong to me. You'll never leave me." The room felt like it was closing in on him. The fire crackled in the hearth, but all Benjamin could feel was the coldness radiating from Eleanor. He stood up, his heart racing. "I can't do this anymore, Eleanor. I'm leaving." Eleanor's eyes blazed with fury. "You're not going anywhere!" Before Benjamin could react, Eleanor lunged at him, her hands balled into fists. She shoved him hard, sending him stumbling backward. His back hit the edge of the desk, and he cried out in pain. But Eleanor wasn't finished. She grabbed a heavy silver candlestick from the mantelpiece and raised it above her head, her eyes wild with rage. In that moment, Benjamin saw his life flash before his eyes. He knew he had to get out of there, but his body was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. Eleanor swung the candlestick with all her strength, and Benjamin barely had time to duck out of the way. The candlestick crashed into the desk, leaving a deep dent in the wood. "Eleanor, stop!" Benjamin shouted, but she wasn't listening. She was beyond reason now, consumed by her fury and paranoia. She swung the candlestick again, this time connecting with Benjamin's shoulder. He cried out in pain as he stumbled backward, clutching his arm. Blood was already starting to seep through his shirt, and he could feel the heat of it spreading across his skin. But Eleanor didn't stop. She kept coming, swinging the candlestick wildly, her eyes wide with a manic gleam. Benjamin knew he had to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The doors were locked, and Eleanor was blocking the only way out. He was trapped. In one last desperate move, he grabbed a chair and swung it in Eleanor's direction, hoping to slow her down. The chair hit her in the side, knocking her off balance for a moment, but it wasn't enough to stop her. She screamed in rage and lunged at him again, this time swinging the candlestick with deadly precision. The blow landed squarely on Benjamin's head, and he crumpled to the floor, his vision going dark. He could feel the blood running down his face, warm and sticky, but the pain was fading. Everything was fading. Eleanor stood over him, breathing heavily, the candlestick still clenched in her hand. For a moment, there was silence. Then, as if waking from a trance, she looked down at Benjamin's lifeless body and let out a strangled gasp. "What have I done?" she whispered, dropping the candlestick with a clatter. Her hands were shaking, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. She staggered backward, her eyes wide with shock. For a moment she stood frozen, staring at the blood pooling around Benjamin's head. Then, the realization of what she had done hit her like a freight train. She had killed him. She had actually killed him. Panic set in. Eleanor's mind raced as she tried to come up with a plan. She couldn't let anyone know what had happened. No one would believe it was an accident, not with the obvious injuries Benjamin had sustained. She had to cover it up, make it look like a terrible fall or an accident. With shaking hands, she dragged Benjamin's body across the room, struggling with his dead weight. She pulled him to the base of the grand staircase and positioned him at the foot, making it look as though he had tripped and fallen down the stairs. She wiped the blood from the candlestick and returned it to the mantelpiece, erasing any trace of her involvement. At 9:30 p.m., Eleanor made the call to emergency services, her voice trembling as she reported that her husband had suffered a terrible fall. When the paramedics arrived, Eleanor played the part of the grieving widow perfectly, clutching her chest and sobbing as they examined Benjamin's body. But deep down, she knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. The night Benjamin Morris died, the Donovan estate became the scene of a tragedy that would shock the quiet town of Birchwood for years to come. When the paramedics arrived at 9:30 p.m., They found Eleanor Donovan in hysterics, standing over the lifeless body of her young husband at the foot of the grand staircase. To the untrained eye, it looked like a tragic accident, an unfortunate fall down the steep staircase of the old mansion. But to those who knew Eleanor, there was something about the scene that didn't quite add up. The paramedics worked quickly, but it was already too late. Benjamin had died from blunt force trauma to the head, his skull fractured in several places. Eleanor clung to the illusion of a grieving widow, clutching her chest and sobbing uncontrollably. But deep down, she knew her performance had to be flawless. The police arrived shortly after, led by Detective Samuel Hayes, a seasoned investigator with over 25 years of experience on the force. He had seen plenty of accidents in his time, but something about this one felt off. As Eleanor recounted her version of events to the police, she wove a tale of heartbreak and sorrow. According to her, Benjamin had been feeling unwell that evening, lightheaded and dizzy. She claimed that he had been on his way to bed when he tripped on the top step, tumbling down the staircase. She found him moments later, already unconscious, and had immediately called for help. But as Detective Hayes surveyed the scene, something didn't sit right with him. The injuries Benjamin had sustained were severe, too severe for a simple fall. And then there was Eleanor herself. Her sobs felt rehearsed, her eyes too sharp and calculating beneath the mask of grief. He made a mental note to dig deeper, even as he outwardly accepted her version of events for the time being. The town of Birchwood was shaken to its core by the news of Benjamin's death. Rumors began to swirl almost immediately, whispers of foul play, of a relationship that had been far from idyllic. People spoke of Eleanor's controlling nature, her iron grip on Benjamin's life, and the strange dynamic between the young man and his much older wife. The once quiet town was now abuzz with speculation. As the investigation unfolded over the following weeks, Detective Hayes grew more convinced that Benjamin's death was no accident. His instincts, honed by years of experience, told him that there was more to this story than met the eye. He began to dig into the couple's past, speaking to neighbors, acquaintances, and anyone who had known Benjamin before his marriage to Eleanor. The picture that emerged was disturbing. People described Eleanor as controlling and manipulative, a woman who had isolated Benjamin from his friends and family. She had cut him off from the outside world, keeping him trapped in the mansion, dependent on her for everything. Friends who hadn't heard from Benjamin in months began to come forward, describing their last conversations with him. One of those friends was Emily Harrington. Emily told Detective Hayes about the last time she had seen Benjamin, just weeks before his death. He had been nervous, anxious, and had confided in her that he felt trapped in his marriage. He had wanted to leave, but he didn't know how. Emily had urged him to get out, but Benjamin had been too afraid. It was a chilling revelation, and it added fuel to Hayes's growing suspicion that Eleanor had played a role in Benjamin's death. The autopsy report only confirmed what Detective Hayes had feared. Benjamin's injuries were inconsistent with a fall down the stairs. The blunt force trauma to his head was too localized, too severe. The medical examiner noted that the injuries were more likely caused by a heavy object, a blow to the head, not an accidental tumble. Armed with this new evidence, Hayes sought a warrant to search the Donovan estate. On a crisp morning in early March, he and his team descended on the mansion, combing through every room, every corner, every hidden space. They were looking for anything that could link Eleanor to the crime. In the grand parlor, Hayes found what he was looking for. The silver candlestick, still sitting on the mantelpiece, bore faint traces of blood that hadn't been cleaned properly. It was the smoking gun, the piece of evidence that tied Eleanor to Benjamin's murder. The bloodstains on the candlestick matched the injuries detailed in the autopsy report. There was no doubt now. Eleanor had killed Benjamin. The arrest came swiftly. Eleanor Donovan, once the queen of Birchwood's social elite, was taken into custody and charged with first-degree murder. The trial, which began in June, became the talk of the town and beyond. The bizarre circumstances of the case, the massive age gap between Eleanor and Benjamin, the controlling nature of their relationship, and the brutal nature of the crime, drew media attention from all over the state. In court, the prosecution painted a damning picture of Eleanor as a manipulative and paranoid woman who had lured Benjamin into a marriage of control and domination. They argued that when Benjamin had tried to assert his independence, Eleanor had snapped, unable to bear the thought of losing her grip on him. The evidence was clear: the autopsy report, the blood-stained candlestick, and the testimonies of those who had known Benjamin in the months leading up to his death. It all pointed to one conclusion: Eleanor had murdered her young husband in a fit of rage. Eleanor's defense team tried to argue that Benjamin's death was a tragic accident, that he had indeed fallen down the stairs, and that Eleanor was devastated by his loss. But the evidence against her was overwhelming. The jury wasn't swayed by her calm demeanor on the stand, nor by her tearful recounting of her version of events. They saw through her lies, and it didn't take long for them to reach a verdict. On June 20th, after only 3 days of deliberation, the jury found Eleanor Donovan guilty of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a punishment fitting for the crime that had shocked the town of Birchwood to its core. The trial may have ended, but the story of Benjamin Morris and Eleanor Donovan lingered in the minds of the townspeople long after the courtroom doors closed. The Donovan mansion, once a symbol of wealth and prestige, stood empty and decaying, a haunting reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. As for Benjamin, his story became a legend in Birchwood, a cautionary tale about the dangers of power, control, and obsession. The young man who had once hoped for a better life had been lured into a deadly web of deceit and manipulation. His fate served as a grim warning to those who believed that wealth and security could protect them from the darkness that lurked behind closed doors. In the end, Eleanor's obsessive need for control had destroyed everything, leaving her alone in the one place she could never escape from: her own guilt.